Welcome everyone to Melfuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about A Murder at the End of the World, episode 3. It's called Chapter 3, Survivors. So spoilers for the episode. Right away, they were hitting some of the themes that we'd been talking about in the first two episodes. One of the first things that happens in the flashbacks, which do pick up more or less where they left off last time, with Darby and Bill on their way to meet the survivor. Although they go to a crime scene first. That's actually where they're going first. But in the car, Bill brings up death by GPS, and it's basically just that whole trusting technology too much. And do you believe that some people actually just trust the GPS so much that they drive into something dangerous without just checking for themselves? So again, right away, they were hitting us with that theme. And then this scene, which ends at this crime scene, where they're talking about where the crime scene is and where the killer buried the body, and it was kind of, it was kind of like he was taunting people by doing it so close to the road, like he was barely hiding it. And Darby says, "Well, do you think he wanted to be caught in some way?" And Bill says, "No, I don't think so. I think he was just so arrogant, and he thought he was so good that he would never be caught." And that felt like a lead into the main timeline to me. That felt like, oh, whoever's doing this thinks they'll not be caught, which does point, probably to Clive Owen's character, Andy. Like, it just, I mean, don't get me wrong, he feels like so obvious right now to be the bad guy that it does seem like it would be weird to just actually leap to that conclusion. I would not be putting any money on anything, because it feels like he's been painted as the obvious one, so it feels like you should back away from that. But then it could be a double, triple, quadruple bluff. Who knows? It immediately, makes you think of him, I guess, a little bit, and that he would think he'd get away with this. But there's obviously many suspects throughout the episode. The main bulk of this episode, though, is pretty much Darby actually trying to investigate the murder. What she was doing last episode, but this episode she's kind of trying to ask questions of people. She's trying to ask questions of the busboy, the waiter, whatever his job title is, room service. He was bringing tea to the room that night, and she wants to ask him some questions, which he doesn't want to answer, because this is a place where he's expected to keep quiet about what he sees and hears. Although it does lead to Darby finding like a floor plan of what all the guests are in the rooms. The hotel staff, the kitchen have got like a map of the hotel up, and like a picture and the nationality and names of all the guests, and she kind of like notes all that down on her arm. But she's asking questions. She lies a little bit to Lee. We'll talk about her conversation with Lee in a little bit. But she lies here at first. She goes around asking questions. Some people are noticing she's kind of interrogating people, and that she's starting to play detective, which is something that Sean, Alice Braga's character, warns her maybe not to do. Maybe that she'd be biting the hand that's going to feed her, is the way she puts it, by antagonizing Andy. So as it gets going, though, and she's looking into things, she ultimately goes following a suspicious figure away from the hotel, and we get this big sequence where she puts on her coat and she goes out following this character in a coat, and it leads up quite a bit away from the hotel. And we don't realize this until late on, when the suspect or whoever it is hears a noise and turns around, but they actually have the mask on, this white mask that this person that went to the room, that at this point I think we were still just assuming was the killer. That seems to maybe not be the case as the episode goes on, of course, but it's a creepy moment on its own, and Darby having to hide to avoid his capture. I thought this was a very nice looking scene, because it felt very unique. The way the light was bouncing off of these sort of this ice and the glaciers or whatever it was, and it felt very different to typically how I'd expect a nighttime scene to look, and that's just down to the location, or at the very least the location they're emulating. So it had a really specific look to it, and I thought that was cool. But she sees this figure use Morse code, funnily enough. We set up that she knows how to understand it last episode. She doesn't quite catch all of it, but it's basically one down, and then it seems like she misses a word, and then to go, as if one down, one to go, one down, two to go, something like that. obviously at this point, I think everyone's like, okay, he's talking about like Bill's dead. There's another victim left. There's another or two victims left, whatever. And it's like, okay, that builds up that this is some sort of plan to kill multiple people, maybe, right? And again, by later in the episode, I think these are all thrown out the window, and it's a lot more complicated than that, because the one thing Darby sees, of course, on this person is the shoes that he's wearing. She sees brown boots with red laces, and this builds up to like, okay, that's something to look for later. And sure enough, the next day, Andy has them all go out to this sort of high point in the land to look down at something he wants to show them. I'll talk about that in a minute because it's another big separate idea. But when they're getting all changed back into their regular clothes, she noticed these shoes with the red laces waiting for someone to take them. Like, so she's going to find out who they belong to. And it just so happens that, you know, the guys who are kind of shitheads are not very nice. There's one guy that keeps calling her a small girl or a young girl and belittles her a little bit. But it's not him. You think he's going to take them, but he takes the shoes that are next to them. And it's actually Rohan who takes them. And the reason why this is an effective little moment is because on the way up on this little trip, Darby intentionally went to talk to him. She tried to talk to him at the sort of dinner party earlier in the episode because he cried when Bill's death was being announced and they were talking about it. She noticed his reaction to Bill's death, which painted the picture that he might know Bill quite well in some way. So she goes to talk to him, and he does open up a little bit about knowing Bill well, Bill telling him about her. He's still, don't get me wrong, he's still withholding information seemingly, but he says that Bill got him sober, but he's drinking now. He's been drinking since Bill died. And it sets up this sort of flawed character who really deeply cares about Bill. So it feels like Darby, if anything, has bonded with him a little bit over that conversation. So it kind of hits you a little bit harder when it's him that picks up those shoes. And immediately she says what the Morse code was, which is one down, something to go. It seems like he does recognize that, confirming, in fact, that, yeah, it's not just the shoes. He seems to be aware that she's heard or saw the message being delivered, and tells her to not ask questions. He basically runs and gets to the truck and just gets away from her as quickly as he can. But notably, when he kind of snaps at her and runs away, people notice this. Andy notices this. And this is important for later when Andy tries to get rid of her. So, not in a murder way, just in a go back home kind of way. These scenes were very effective. I think, you know, setting Rohan up as this character who cared about Bill, but then pulling the twist where he's the one who might be responsible. I think, though, the second that they revealed it was Rohan, my first instinct was, well, okay, I believe he was the one wearing the mask, but I'm now convinced that the person wearing the mask isn't necessarily the killer. And sure enough, we find out later that the morphine that Bill took kicked in before Rohan visited him, right? It was already in his system because the rooms monitor the heart rates and the vitals of the guests, and they knew it was before he went to see them. So, but instantly it was like, okay, I don't think they're going to tell me that Rohan killed him now. I feel like what they're going to do now is that he was there for another reason, and he didn't want a record of going to see him because him and Bill, it sounds like later on when because he phones Darby before the end of the episode, tells her that Bill wanted to tell him something because he discovered something. But he does say that before that they had a plan, which kind of implied, at this point I would guess that Bill was planning some kind of art exhibit's not the right word, art spectacle, I'll call it, because we see on the news when his death's been talking about on the news, we see some examples of what type of art, graffiti style art he does. One of the ones that they mention is that he took the S down off of the Shell logo at different gas stations for the Americans, petrol stations for everywhere else. Well, not everywhere else. I have no idea what Australia calls a petrol station, but yeah, or a garage, as we also call them. That's funny, of course, right? And it ties into the themes of climate change, which has been talked about. And that's something Rohan even talked about, that a lot of climate experts actually end up getting quite happy to commit suicide because they see the future coming and don't want to be here for it. And that Bill changed his life and made him better because Bill offered this perspective that, okay, humans might all be doomed, but new life will form on Earth. It won't just be a desolate wasteland. There'll be a new type of species that new animals will flourish because humans are gone, and things will maybe settle a little bit more again. It's this idea that Bill had this outlook on the world, and that's what he was trying to spread. But yeah, the shell turning into hell thing was quite funny. It's all very activist style stuff and protesting parts of the system and all that kind of thing. So my guess would be that Bill was going to do something like that here, and that Rohan had become his friend and was helping him pull off some of these feats. So he was probably going to maybe protest Andy, maybe, with some big display of some kind. But of course, Rohan says Bill found something out, and he needed to tell me. So I secretly went to his room, but he never got a chance to tell me. Because Rohan assumed that Bill was wasted and left angry that he was wasted, but obviously knows now that Bill was in fact drugged. But just before he tells Darby well, not what the secret was, because Bill never got to tell him, but right before he's about to tell her something else, that's when seemingly he starts to die and never gets to finish his sentence. So they do the big cock tease, both for the audience and for Darby and what Rohan was about to say. But that was, it was effective enough. And of course, the big thing by this point in the episode is that Andy is telling Darby that she's going back home. He tells her that she's getting lost, that her interrogating the guests is not really good for everyone and what they're trying to accomplish, and insists that she's leaving. And she doesn't want to. She tries to fight him on it, but it's actually really nice because there's not a lot of flashbacks in this episode. We get the early ones, we get them arriving at the survivor's house, and then it cuts away, and we go a long time at that point with no flashbacks. But the moment the flashbacks come back in and we get this long flashback of them talking to the survivor, is really a really good point in the episode for it, because it ends up sort of like helping motivate the present day decision, because Darby does seem like she's probably going to adhere to what she's been asked to do when she goes into the room to pack. But we get this flashback of her and Bill talking to the survivor, who is being quite cynical and not particularly... She clearly doesn't believe that these two are going to help solve this crime. She thinks it's a dead end. She doesn't think it's going to help. But the big part of the scene that really gets to is she's asking why they're doing this, and they're saying they're angry, and Darby kind of convinces her to help by saying, when I was your daughter's age, I thought I was important, but then I grew up and realized I wasn't, and I would rather young girls grow up feeling like they are important when they get older. And that kind of convinces her enough to like say, hey, there was a bit of evidence in the car the police ignored because they just didn't care. And it's a silver pin. And the thing that's established here that I don't think, at least I realized in the previous two episodes, is that these silver things that he's leaving with the victims are coming from the previous victims. So this piece of evidence that was left with her is probably belongs to a previous victim. And they kind of like convince her that they're getting results because Bill posts it to the message board that helped them solve these things and says, hey, does anyone know where this ring might have came from? And within a minute, they get a bunch of replies saying it's a high school ring from a particular city and state and whatever. I don't remember what the specifics were, but the victim, the survivor, sees this and immediately feels like these two young people who, at this point, I think Darby's still a teenager at this point, and Bill's like maybe 20 or something like that. They're getting results that the police never even bother looking for, and it's happened relatively that quickly. They've already sort of tracked down and connected her to a previous victim, and she says, please don't give up on this. Stop this guy from doing it to anyone else. And then it cuts back to the present day stuff, and that's when Darby starts plotting and like going against whatever the plan was before. That she phones the desk and says, tell Andy I'm keeping my room. And obviously I'm thinking the whole time that she's not actually going to go home, because that's not the premise of the show, unless the show becomes something very different. And of course, what actually seems to end up resulting in her staying is a combination of two things. One, it's Rohan's murder, which kind of is enough of chaos to sort of stop the forced deportation, if you will, of her, because all this chaos is going on. But also we hear that there's a storm coming to the local city with the airport. So probably the final line from Andy is to get everyone in the basement. Probably is tied to the storm as more than it is anything else. But Darby is staring right at Andy the entire time. You know, because Andy's been writing this off. Now, whether it's because he's actually guilty of something and he is trying to cover it up, or he genuinely was writing everything off with ignorance and saying, no, there's no murder here, there's no investigation needed. But Darby's staring right at him, daggers in the eyes at the end of the episode. So he's got some explaining to do to Darby, it would seem. Obviously, the one big scene that I've glossed over in the present day stuff, I would say, is the Lee and Darby scene. Lee comes to see Darby in the middle of the episode and explains a few things. Explains that there was like a momentary, like, possible fling that might have started that it kind of went nowhere, and her and Bill were never really in a relationship or anything like that. It explains that he came and found her, and that he'd read her manifesto and had told Lee about Darby, and seemingly sought her out, I would assume, because Darby built her up and like talked about her and sort of said who she was and all the rest of it, and tries to be seemingly quite honest with her. Darby shows her the footage of the mask. Lee explains that it's a mask that's designed to get past an AI system sort of facial recognition. So whoever's using that mask is just making sure the cameras can't tell who they are, and that's its purpose. So it's like, okay, at that point it's like, okay, anyone who knows anything about tech could probably be behind the mask, and obviously by the end we know it's Rohan, but that doesn't make it say that it's just one mask. In fact, there's a great little sequence early on where Darby's looking around the room at all the guests, and they're all wearing the mask, and it's obviously the intent of this scene is that Darby in the moment feels that she can't trust any of them because any one of them could have been wearing that mask. Any one of them could be the killer. Obviously, by the end of the episode, things are a little bit murkier in that now we don't necessarily think the person wearing the mask, who we know is Rohan, necessarily killed Bill. But at the same time, there could be more than one of these masks. It's a pretty basic thing. So maybe it suggests that someone working at the hotel is in on the attacks. Maybe it suggests that someone with power, which would mean Andy or whoever, is doing stuff. It's hard to say at this point, but intriguing all the same. Also, Rohan did mention he had a pacemaker in this episode, so that probably maybe plays into how he passed away. We don't get a lot of details. We just see him kind of go down and stop breathing as if he's having a heart attack or something akin to that. Why also just so the technology of the episode's the other big thing I want to talk about. There's a few things that notably really stick out, which quite frankly put this over the line, I would say, into science fiction, which is not a complaint. I love science fiction, but I think before it was just very much, oh, this all feels kind of like pretty much like just like around the corner, and it still kind of is, but I think when Andy shows them he's got a fleet of robots that work together and repair each other and build tunnels and bridges, and they're doing all the hard work so humans don't have to. And the idea is that if the climate gets worse, these robots can do a lot of the work, a lot of the heavy lifting on the outside and things like that. I was like, oh shit, okay, we're just sci-fi now because we've got a fleet of robots. But no, it's fun. It was a fun visual. It was kind of an interesting thing to get in this show because it's not something that's had a lot of big, grandiose visuals like that. It's had very nice cinematography. It's had atmospheric cinematography. It's had some philosophical ideas about technology and things like that. But this was a bit more like, oh no, we're actually just seeing the future in front of us. And I thought that was a very interesting thing, especially when we're constantly talking about trusting AI and can you trust AI? Because clearly a lot of good things come from technology in this show so far. Bill and Darby are able to find and track down a killer because of the technology, use technology to get into the house where they think the killer's been. These are all good uses of the technology. One of the scenes right before Andy tells Darby she's being sent back home is her hanging out with his kid, and he's got like this fancy VR helmet that operates on its own, and she puts it on, and we actually get to see this kind of computer digitized world, try to chase this crown around. This technology is bringing him happiness. It's something that brings joy, and there's lots of good examples. And well, they could pull a swerve on me with the AI that Darby keeps talking to. I think Ray's the name of it. So far, it has been very helpful. It's very polite. It's there's obviously certain things it's not allowed to tell her, but he is constantly helping and being very informative with a lot of the information. She does a lot of Googling with him early on in the episode. Although notably, they don't have a live internet feed. He's got like a cache from like a week ago. He's not got actual direct connection to the internet, which again might be something that's important for other plot details. Sorry, going forward. I don't know, but yeah, I think these themes being hit harder as we go. Like, I feel like every episode has done something to bring the climate conversation back into it. It's done something to bring the technology back into it. But of course, at the center of all this, we have murder. We have people doing harm to other people. Now, I suppose one way this could go is that technology itself is the culprit. That would be a big leap at this point, I think. But, I'm not going to like just rule it out necessarily. Like, the option is absolutely there. I think watching the dangers of the technology and the things that it's helping with in making things better throughout, but also how it can be exploited as time goes on. I think it's very interesting that Lee is a character. Darby asks her repeatedly, you could have hacked into those cameras yourself, but why didn't you? And she basically just says, because I'm a mother to a kid who has sleeping trouble, and I also have to help my husband run this place. They're both full-time jobs. I just don't have time. I think it's interesting to add into these themes that her character is someone who wishes she was still using technology, but now is completely consumed with other humans instead. Like, that part of her life is like disconnected, and she's almost longing to be back there. She says she would love to be in a closet just hacking for a few hours, but she's not got time for that. She's dealing with humans instead. I think that's an interesting little detail to bring up and kind of prod at how these characters treat technology and what it means to them. The idea that their son is relying on technology as a play friend and the AI is a play friend because there's no other kids around. I mean, the kid even says to Darby, "You're the next youngest person here," and she's like, "I guess that's true. So, yeah, sure, I'll play for a minute." And that's like a sweet little moment because she's almost going to say no, and the kid's like, "Oh, you're too busy." And she's like, no, okay. Since he looks disappointed, she's like, no. Oh, give me the helmet. Let's give this a try. It's a little human moment as well, just to sort of make you, root for Darby a little bit. Not that she needs it necessarily at this point, but it's a little bit of heart in the middle of an episode that's mostly looking for killers and not trusting people. It's like, well, the kid has to be trustworthy, right? Well, to a point anyway. Which also, Andy goes on a little bit about Walt Disney and how he, like, people thought he was crazy. They didn't think animated film was possible, and he proved them wrong and had a smash hit on his hands. And then he was testing basically the prototype and figuring out what would eventually be Disneyland by having a toy train that he was riding on going through his house. And it was him playing about to visualize what something one day could be. And the fact that this comes right after the scene with the VR helmet, which I guess is also augmented reality as well, because it's kind of shaping the world around the actual hallways and design and the architecture of the room they're in, so the kid doesn't just run into a wall, obviously. I guess you could argue that, he's exploring these ideas, and it is one of the ideas that they're going to live in a simulated world where they won't actually go out and interact with each other anymore. I mean, that would tie in with all these machines doing all the work on the outside, I suppose. But just a bit of thought there. I do really appreciate that Darby's motivation is kind of reinforced when she thinks back to her early time on the original Silver Doe case, and that the idea that the victim didn't want her to give up. And now, because she actually cares about Bill, she doesn't want to give up. And people keep saying that she's a detective, and she's like, no, I'm not a detective, I'm an amateur sleuth. Lee offers to pay her to find out who killed Bill or who was in the mask, and she's like, no, I don't do it for money. But it seems like when Bill spoke about her, he did describe her as this great detective because she was great at it. She thought about things, and we see that earlier on in the episode when they're in the car and he's offering up ideas, she's like giving reasons why she doesn't think some of them are true, but she's getting to like closer to the potential goal of, you know, why, you know, they're talking about the silver items, I think, and it's like, oh, are they trophies? No, they're not quite trophies, they're a trail, which almost suggests that he wants to be caught, and or not caught, but he wants someone to be able to follow his path, and maybe that's the idea, that there's an end game in mind. And if that thematically links in, you know, this idea of the killer wants to leave a trail to see if anyone's smart enough to figure it out and get to him, because the thrill of that showdown, if you want to call it that, is something that's tantalizing. It does beg the question: is someone doing that with Darby here? It's very interesting. I don't think Darby asks who invited her. She asks who invited Bill, and it was Andy who invited Bill, but Lee says that she encouraged him to come. So, I mean, an obvious possible motive that Darby might have in her head right now is that Andy suspected, much like she did, that Bill and Lee had some kind of an affair. And whether he knows that they did or didn't, maybe he was still jealous of the friendship they had, and maybe that's like a motive. That does feel kind of simple given the grand schemes, the grand themes that we're dealing with here, and how everything feels a bit more complex than that. But it's definitely something that, you know, is open as a possibility that he might have. That's maybe a motivation if he is the one behind doing this. But again, that does feel quite obvious at this point, so it's hard to nail that down. But I think, you know, I've been saying this about this show now for the first 3 episodes, is that it's doing a great job of the human moments, and really those moments where Darby is vulnerable or alone, or she's emotional, or she's having to try and make decisions in the moment, or where she's hit with a wave of, like, you know, when she sees Bill's photo on the board with everyone else, it's like a moment, you know, it coughs her up a little bit. And I think that kind of thing is, the show is so good at that with its direction, and the directors here, Zal and Brit, have done such a good job of like capturing those little moments with the character. Oh, which reminds me, one of the other moments where Ray, the AI, has been very effective and helpful is when she comes back from spying on the man in the mask, who later turns out to be Rohan. She's obviously been out in the cold for an extended period of time, and the AI is like, hey Darby, your body temperature is not good, like you have to do this, this, and this, and gives her lots of good advice, tells her what part of her body to heat up, tells her where she can get a medical blanket and a hot water bottle, and things like that. And he takes care of her, he's nurturing, and that's a very fascinating kind of element to that. Which actually leads me to another moment, that something that Andy says and reveals, is that the AI system Ray is actually the offspring of 2 other AIs, or computer systems. He realized that he had to make a good AI, to make something that was truly next level, he had to have a mate. He had to have 2 AIs mate and make an offspring, which is a wild way of phrasing it, but it's a very fascinating wrinkle to what Ray is. And Ray's been such a prominent like part of this show up until this point. I think this says to me that another big theme of this show is obviously the idea of children. Obviously we've got Lee and Andy with their kid, and Darby interacts with them. The subject of children comes up in the scene where they're talking to the survivor. She talks about her daughter, she talks about being a child herself. In fact, there's a moment right before he reveals this where Andy says, "You're good with kids," and she says, I was one. And Andy says, that doesn't always help. But it's interesting to think that on some level, Ray, the AI, was a child, and at least in the sense that he came from 2 other beings. So that's kind of interesting. And that Ray is being quite nurturing and helpful to Darby. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name for a second while I'm just thinking about my what I'm saying here in the grand scheme of things. It's this idea of how parents are with their kids and how they treat their kids, because, you know, Darby's relationship with her father is something that's came up throughout these episodes. Not so much this one as much, but the last couple. She learned all of these detective skills effectively by being the daughter of a coroner and being there at crime scenes. Like, that relationship's what opened all those doors in so many ways. But we see how much of kind of a weird relationship and kind of kind of a distant relationship they seem to have to a point anyway. Obviously, he still clearly cares about her. You heard that in the phone call in the first episode, but we've had a fair bit of that relationship, and I do wonder if we're going down a path here of comparing how a human takes care of another human and how a human cares about another human versus how an AI cares about a human, and can it care about a human? Does Ray care about the people that he is helping and protecting? Is that possible? And I do wonder if it is or isn't possible yet, then is that sort of an idea that we're going to touch upon by the time we get to the end of this show? What's the point of saving the world if we don't care about each other? And can that pass on to artificial intelligence or alternative intelligence, as Andy likes to call it? So these are all really cool ideas, and at this point I don't really have any solid like feelings of exactly where it's going, and I kind of love that actually. That's kind of great. But now we have two dead bodies, so now it's like, okay, this is maybe they can try and spin this as, oh, he really cared about Bill, so now he's, it depends on how they think he died, I suppose. If it looks like he just drank himself to death and it killed his pacemaker, maybe they'll just think, oh, this was self-inflicted again. But at this point, it's a bit of a coincidence if there's two people who have died. Actually, wasn't it Bill that said last episode or something that it's too much of a coincidence for there not to be any coincidences? He said something like that last episode. It was a really, a little philosophical line, but they stuck out to me, which I kind of liked. Which maybe sets up that there will be at least one coincidence in how things are solved maybe later or something. I don't know. Yeah, all that stuff, all these themes that they're bringing up with AI, with technology, the comparisons to Walt Disney, the shaping of the future, and then the idea that you're doing all this for the next generation, so that naturally leads to these themes about children and about looking after your children, and how someone who used to be kind of like Darby, this super hacker with a manifesto. Most people don't have a manifesto, but Lee had a manifesto. But now she's a mother. Now she's looking after a child, and that's kind of her number one priority. These are all just threads and connections that I'm kind of noticing as I'm watching, and it is making it a lot more rich as I watch it, because looking for all these details and how they all feel like they're coming together in some way is cool. And actually, talking about AI, can it care about someone? Is that something we're getting to? That kind of links back to that conversation in episode 2 about AI creating art. Can it create real art? Would it be good art? Obviously, that's a big topic right now in the real world. And in the real world, the answer is no, for the record. Like, at least not yet anyway. But in the context of like thinking about the future, like this show is obviously doing, it is raising this interesting question. If an AI does become like a living being, if it becomes sentient, that's a very different thing to a computer algorithm building a piece of art. So, I think these are interesting ideas. I love all these subjects. I think it's great stuff. So, we've got a murder mystery. We've got the sci-fi element creeping in. We've got these interesting character dynamics, but we do have this single location with a lot, and I love a good single location, especially if they're going to be trapped inside for like an episode or even the rest of the show. I don't know how long the storm's going to last or how like condensed this next part of the story is. Like maybe the rest of it will take place over the space of like a day or two. I have no idea. Probably not, but it's a possibility. Then the atmosphere you get from that kind of thing is I love. So Darby's had a stay of execution, as it were. Although that's probably poor wording, given that people are actually being executed on the show. But we'll see. So I don't have any solid theories, but I have proposed a number of possible directions as we've talked. Hopefully, some of that was interesting, or just maybe helped you think of some of your own ideas about the show. And by all means, in the comments, do give me your own theories about what you think certain elements of the show are saying about characters or about where we're going in the plot. But that has been my thoughts on Chapter 3 Survivors. I'll be back next week with Chapter 4. I'm enjoying the show very much and think it's a really good time. I will say, like, I was surprised to see this episode was 65 minutes again. I was like, oh, okay, we're just doing long episodes every week now, I guess. Which I remember the OA kind of being like that. I think it had like one shockingly short episode that was like 32 minutes, but most of them varied from like an hour to like 80 minutes or something silly like that. So I shouldn't be surprised, but I guess I just didn't think FX would be as game to let them do that. But if as of yeah, I've not felt like they've not used the time wisely. I've not had any pacing issues with the show. Obviously, it's not a super high pace, high impact type of drama or anything like that. It's not an action show, but I think its pacing is working very well because it's it really gives time for all those intimate moments and I think that's kind of the bread and butter of what makes it all work. So I have no critiques on that other than just commenting, oh yes, this is over an hour again. So let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that stuff helps out a lot if you do. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?